Okay, so today we're starting in plant stems, growing from the roots then into the areas which are above ground for the most part, right? Now, plant stems can be categorized by the way that the leaves protrude or grow out of them. So we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about leaves, but you can have three different arrangements of leaves for the most part. This is all you have. You have the alternate arrangement where the leaves alternate different sides as they go up the stem. You can have opposite where two leaves come out at the same point as it goes up the stem. And then you have whorled where you have three or more leaves coming out at the same point. Okay, and that's just one way to categorize stems in general. Now, a stem is then defined by its ability to grow leaves. Basically, it has nodes where you have buds forming and then internodes between them. So if it has nodes and internodes, it is a stem. And that applies whether it is underground, above ground, or in water or anywhere else. The leaf grows from then these axillary buds. And the leaf has the blade, which is the flattened part, and the petiole, which is the stalk. There also are sometimes these small stipules, which are little leaf-like projections. Some of them can be modified into spines as well. The terminal bud then doesn't grow leaves. It instead is the site of the meristem, the apical meristem. So it is responsible for primary growth. Okay, and then in deciduous trees, where these leaves fall off, those leaves will then lead scars. So you will have leaf scars and bundle scars where the vascular xylem and phloem was. So at the apical meristem, or the site of primary growth, which would be at the very end, the terminal buds, you have bud scales on both sides, which help to protect the bud itself. And then you have leaf primordia, which are the beginnings of leaves that will eventually grow into and develop into leaves during the growing season. During both bud formation and or seed germination, you then have the apical meristems growing into and maturing into specific tissue types. So the protoderm becomes the epidermis, the procambium becomes the primary xylem and phloem, and the ground meristem becomes the parenchyma cells of the pith and cortex. Okay, and then the pith and cortex can be replaced by other tissues in woody plants. As these primary tissues are produced, the primordia and leaf primordia develop into leaves and buds. And they also need xylem and phloem, so they will have their own passage of xylem and phloem through them, which is called a trace. And the trace also leaves a gap in the vertical vasculature, in the vertical xylem and phloem. And so you have a leaf gap, or you have a bud gap where the bud was, which interrupts that vasculature. The lateral meristems then are, of course, for lateral growth or secondary growth, and are contained within a narrow band between the primary xylem and phloem. So this then becomes the vascular cambium, also just referred to as the cambium. The cambium develops into tracheids, vessel elements, and fibers on the inner side, which are part of the phloem, and then sieve tube members and companion cells on the external side, which becomes the phloem. Woody species then develop another layer of secondary growth or a meristem called the cork cambium, also called the phloem, and that produces these box-shaped cork cells, which also fill with suberin, which is waxy, which gives them their waterproof capabilities. And then it also is hardened, and so it can protect against physical damage, things running into it, or other trees and so forth. There are some areas within the bark which need to be opened and allow gas to exchange, so lentils are those areas. Now, stems can also be defined by their stele, which is the center part of the tissue. Now, the stele may have primary xylem and phloem in it. It may also have pith in younger roots and shoots, but it can be different depending on their monocots or dicots. And then a protostele is what the some of the primitive plants have, like ferns. Some ferns have it, which is just slightly different arrangement. But true steles or eusteles have primary xylem and phloem in discrete bundles, and those are found in flowering plants, which are called angiosperms, and cone-bearing plants, which are called conifers. Okay, another important development part of stems are the cotyledons. Okay, so a dicot has basically two halves to its seeds, and those two halves are called cotyledons. And when that part of the seed then develops, the stem starts to grow from it, it will form two leaves, whereas a monocot, which only has one cotyledon, it only forms one leaf as it matures. Alright, so depending on whether you have an herbaceous or woody plant, you will have different types or different arrangements of cells and tissues within your stems. So annual plants are herbaceous, meaning they are mostly green and photosynthetic. They do not have secondary growth for the most part. They're just mostly primary tissue. So they grow vertically, they flower, seed, and then in the same year they will die. Now in them, the vascular bundles have patches of xylem and phloem arranged in a cylinder, and you can see that in this cross-section here. These are the vascular bundles. The cambium layers then form between the xylem and phloem. Okay. Woody dicot stems, so these are then ones which do not die annually but are around for multiple years, right? They have secondary growth which forms rings, and there's two parts of this. In the spring you have a xylem which is formed and is light in color, and these are usually very big cells. Okay, and then throughout the summer you have smaller amounts of vessel elements being produced, so it's usually a more dense and darker color. And that is also because there's more tracheids being produced. Okay, and that is called summerwood. So springwood and summerwood then make a complete ring, and you can see that in the wood of these woody plants. Now this will vary in the density. If you have a lot of rainfall, there's lots of water, not lots of need for xylem, you will have a bigger springwood band. Or if you have damage, that can decrease the amount of xylem production. Fires will also show. You'll have fire scars in there, and so you can actually count the rings till the fire scar to determine how long ago a fire was in the area. And to count how old a tree is, you can count the rings. And one of the ways to do that is to bore a little section out of the tree down to the middle, and then count these individual rings. Each one is corresponding to one year of growth. So in a woody dicot stem, you have then, this is a cross section, you have areas of basically transverse or lateral movement for nutrients, and these are called vascular rays. So here's a thick vascular ray, here's some thinner vascular rays here. As they go through the xylem, they're called xylem rays, and as they go through the phloem, they're called phloem rays. Okay, and then the phloem rays have these narrow bands And then this is a broad phloem ray, this big section here. Okay. Now, as a tree ages, the xylem in the middle, the older xylem, will start to be no longer functional because it will increase with resins, gums, and tannins, and that will block the ability of water to flow through it. And it will also give it a darker pigment to the wood. And so that is called heartwood, okay, the darker part. And then the sapwood then is lighter in color because it is still functional as xylem. Okay, so you have your heartwood in the middle, and then the sapwood towards the edges. Hardwoods then have xylem that is a little bit different than softwood. So hardwoods have xylem that have lots of tracheids and fibers and vessel elements, which make it more dense and harder. Whereas softwoods have their xylem, which consists primarily of tracheids, so less of the fibers and vessel elements, which can give it thickness. Alright, so then in these woody stems, you also have the production of bark, which is produced outside of the vascular cambium. Some people refer to bark as two layers: the inner bark, which consists of the primary and secondary phloem, and then the outer bark, which is the cork tissue and the cork cambium. Okay, so the cork cambium makes its own box-like cells which form that outer layer of bark. But some people include this layer of phloem in what they call bark. So the older phloem and parenchyma cells of the cortex will get squished and kind of destroyed and then like pressed into the bark, so it becomes part of the bark as well. There are also pores within the bark called latispheres, which produce latex, and that latex can sometimes be used for different things. So this is a good figure that shows, everything we kind of talked about. So you have your vascular rays, which are coming from, this would be the center, and this would be out towards the edge. The outer part is the bark. You have the sieve tube members of the phloem and the fibers. And then the xylem has vessels and tracheids within it. Okay, and then as you go further and further in, these vessels and tracheids would be filled with resin and no longer have a functional or continuous flow. Okay, and then you have the vascular cambium right here, which is responsible for your lateral growth. Okay, so monocot stems, then monocots are almost all herbaceous plants, and they do not have a vascular or cork cambium. So xylem and phloem occurs in bundles throughout the cross-section of the stem. Okay, you can see it here. Xylem is always central, and phloem is always peripheral, so the inside and the outside. The phloem is entirely sieve tubes and companion cells surrounded by a sheath of sclerenchyma cells. Okay, so you can see that, a closer view of that here. Some monocot stems do get quite woody in appearance, but they do not have a true vascular cambium, so they cannot actually produce true bark, and do not have lateral meristems. Instead, what they do is their parenchyma cells continue to divide, and that pushes out further and further. And palm trees are an example of that. They also do have intercalary meristems, which increase the length of the stem as well throughout the growing season. Alright, so now we're going to talk about some of the specialized stems, so some of the ways that stems are used by plants other than just growing leaves. So rhizomes are horizontal stems which grow under the ground. They can be fleshy or thin, and they usually have adventitious roots and can even sprout another stem upward. Runners are horizontal stems that grow above ground. So the best example of this is strawberries, and they have really long internodes. And once they kind of run along the ground, they can also form adventitious roots and new stems to become a new plant, which can be completely separated from the parent plant. Stolons are similar, except they are produced beneath the surface of the ground, and they grow in different directions, so not just horizontally. So a rhizome grows horizontal. Stolons can grow in any direction. So potatoes are an example of that. The sprouts which come out of potatoes are stems that grow in any direction, which would qualify them as stolons. Tubers are food storage stems, so they have lots of starch or sugars within them, which makes them swell, and so that's what we have, like potatoes and yams, carrots. Carrots are a root, so that doesn't count. Bulbs then are large buds surrounded by fleshy leaves and a small stem. Okay, so examples of that are onions. Then you have a lot of the monocot flowers, such as tulips, hyacinth, and crocus. Anyway, here's a bunch from here. And they grow from, then, these bulbs. And then, so these fleshy parts are for food storage so that they have an ample supply of nutrients to grow in the spring before they can develop photosynthetic leaves. Corms are very similar to bulbs, but they are almost entirely stem tissue except for very small scale, like leaves that cover the surface. Okay, so here's a bunch of corms here. You see very thin very thin leaves is what those are. The rest of this is stem. They also produce adventitious roots. Cladophylls are stems which are flattened, which look kind of like very small leaves. An example of that is asparagus. So mature asparagus, not the stuff that you would eat, grows out, kind of fans out into this to expand, which allows for more photosynthesis to occur. But all of that tissue there is stems. There are also other specialized stems. So cacti have fleshy stems for water storage. They can also be modified as thorns on cacti or other plants. Climbing plants also have modified stems called tendrils, which can wrap around things to anchor the plant. And some of them even have adhesive discs which stick to substrate so that they can have an anchoring point for growing more.